The Vietnam War and Protest Era, 1960s to 1970s. If you enjoy calm storytelling, please subscribe and like the video to help this channel grow. The camera opens on a humid dawn in Southeast Asia. Water buffalo move through shallow paddies, mist drifting over palm trees. A distant rumble, first thunder, then rotors. The year is the early 1960s, but the road to this moment began long before. France once ruled this land as part of Indochina. After World War II, Vietnamese nationalists led by Ho Chi Minh fought for independence. In 1954, after the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, France accepted defeat. The Geneva Accords divided Vietnam at the 17th parallel, with the North controlled by the Communist-led Democratic Republic of Vietnam and the South governed by the U.S. backed Republic of Vietnam. National elections to reunify the country were promised but never held. Lines on a map hardened into different governments, different armies, different futures. South Vietnam's leader, Ngo Dinh Diem, tried to create stability but ruled with a rigid hand. He resisted rivals, jailed critics, and pushed harsh programs that relocated villagers to fortified strategic hamlets. Many Southerners resented these measures and the favoritism shown to certain groups. In the countryside, an insurgency grew, the National Liberation Front, or Viet Cong, supported by the North and fueled by local grievances. Attacks on outposts and officials became common, and the Saigon government felt increasingly fragile. In Washington, presidents weighed the future like men balancing glass. Dwight D. Eisenhower and then John F. Kennedy sent advisors, pilots, and aid, hoping to support the South without plunging into a full-scale war. Kennedy authorized more advisors and helicopters, but he hesitated to deploy combat divisions. Meanwhile, South Vietnam faced crisis. In 1963, Buddhist monks protested religious discrimination. A single image of Tiet Quang Duc setting himself on fire in Saigon told the world how deep the anger ran. That November, with the situation deteriorating, Diem was overthrown and killed in a coup. Political chaos followed, generals rotated through power, the insurgency grew bolder. After Kennedy's assassination, President Lyndon B. Johnson inherited a conflict he neither started nor fully understood. He wanted to pass civil rights legislation and build a great society at home, yet feared a collapse in Vietnam would embolden communist movements abroad in the Cold War chessboard. In August 1964, reports came of attacks on U.S. destroyers in the Gulf of Tonkin. The second incident was later doubted, but events moved quickly. Congress passed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, authorizing the President to take all necessary measures. It was not a declaration of war, but it acted like one. In 1965, Operation Rolling Thunder began, a sustained bombing campaign against North Vietnam. Marines landed at Da Nang to guard air bases, soon more troops followed. What had been an advisory mission became a ground war with hundreds of thousands of U.S. personnel deployed. Helicopters, Hueys with their doors open to the wind, stitched the landscape from base to base, carrying soldiers, medics, and hope in equal measure. Firebases appeared like islands in green seas. Patrols moved along trails so narrow that men walked single file, listening for tripwires and the click of a safety lever that might never come. The war's geography was a maze. The enemy used the Ho Chi Minh Trail, a web of paths and roads through Laos and Cambodia, to move troops and supplies south. Villagers in hamlets might feed soldiers at night and sell vegetables to Americans by day. Tunnels honeycombed the earth near Saigon. River deltas hid sampans under canopies of mangrove. In the Central Highlands, the North Vietnamese Army fought more like a conventional force. At Ya Drong in 1965, air mobility and artillery helped U.S. units survive fierce assaults, but the battle also revealed that victory would not be quick. Strategy chased itself in circles. Search and destroy operations tried to find enemy units and inflict losses measured by the body count. Pacification teams tried to protect villages, train local forces, and develop roads and schools. Programs came and went: revolutionary development, Chu Hoi amnesty appeals, combined action platoons. Successes existed, but they were scattered and fragile. The war demanded patience and political legitimacy. Both were hard to sustain when firefights kept resetting conversations back to fear. At home, televisions glowed every night with images from far away, helicopters rising from jungle clearings, flares drifting in black skies, soldiers crouched behind rice paddy dikes. Casualty totals scrolled like scores of a game no one wanted to play. Young men received draft notices, college deferments, marriage, the National Guard, conscientious objector status. These became the vocabulary of choices and moral calculus. Some left for Canada. Some burned draft cards in public squares. Some reported for induction, were given olive drab, and learned to shave in a metal mirror during basic training. Families argued over dinner. Pastors preached for and against the war. A generation asked whether loyalty meant silence or the courage to say no. By 1967, the anti-war movement had become a river with many tributaries. On campuses, students held teach-ins and marches. In New York and San Francisco, crowds filled avenues with signs and songs. Clergy formed groups to counsel draft resistance. Civil rights leaders linked peace abroad with justice at home. Muhammad Ali refused induction on religious grounds. "I ain't got no quarrel with them Viet Cong," and lost his boxing title while his case wound toward the Supreme Court. Music became a second soundtrack to the war: folk guitars in coffee houses, psychedelic rock on festival stages, protest lyrics woven into choruses that people could sing together when words alone felt too thin. Then came 1968, a year that seemed to compress history into months. During the Lunar New Year, the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong launched the Tet Offensive, striking cities across the south, even entering the U.S. Embassy compound in Saigon. Militarily, the attackers were pushed back with heavy losses. Politically, Tet told a different story: the enemy could hit anywhere, anytime, and the assurances of quick victory felt hollow. Television showed street fighting in Hue and the shock on soldiers' faces as they realized the war had shifted beneath their boots. 1968 brought more trauma. In March, U.S. soldiers massacred Vietnamese civilians at My Lai, an atrocity hidden for a time and then revealed in 1969 by investigative reporting and photographs that burned themselves into American memory. In April, Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated in Memphis. Riots broke out in cities across the country. In June, Robert F. Kennedy, a presidential candidate who spoke to working-class and anti-war hopes, was assassinated in Los Angeles after winning the California primary. In August, protests outside the Democratic National Convention in Chicago turned violent as police confronted demonstrators. The nation felt as if it were unraveling: law and order versus civil liberties, patriotism versus dissent, fear versus longing. Richard Nixon won the 1968 presidential election promising peace with honor. His administration pursued a strategy called Vietnamization, training and equipping the South Vietnamese army to take over more of the fighting while U.S. troop levels gradually fell. At the same time, To pressure North Vietnam, the U.S. expanded the air war into neighboring Cambodia and later Laos. In 1970, when Nixon announced an incursion into Cambodia to disrupt enemy sanctuaries, protests surged. At Kent State University, National Guardsmen fired on student demonstrators, killing 4 and wounding 9. Less publicized but just as wrenching, 2 students were killed at Jackson State College in Mississippi after police opened fire on a dormitory. The nation's arguments now had casualties on American soil. Information itself became a battlefield. In 1971, the Pentagon Papers, a secret Defense Department study tracing the war's early decisions, were leaked to the press. The documents revealed a pattern of official optimism in public paired with doubt in private. When the Nixon administration tried to halt publication, the Supreme Court ruled that newspapers could continue. The phrase credibility gap hardened into a chasm. Trust in government fell, and investigative journalism found a sharper edge it would not soon lose. Meanwhile, diplomacy moved in slow circles. Negotiations in Paris struggled over ceasefire lines, definitions of self-determination, and the political future of South Vietnam. On the ground, the war continued, sometimes quiet, sometimes explosive. In 1972, North Vietnam launched the Easter Offensive, a conventional attack with tanks and heavy artillery. The South, with extensive U.S. air support, managed to hold. Strategic bombing intensified in late 1972 during Operation Linebacker II, sometimes called the Christmas bombings, intended to pressure Hanoi back to terms. Finally, in January 1973, the Paris Peace Accords were signed. They called for a ceasefire, the withdrawal of remaining U.S. forces, and the return of prisoners of war. American POWs came home to flags, brass bands, and tears. For many other veterans, homecomings were quieter. Some neighborhoods organized parades, others offered a handshake, a job lead, a seat at the bar, some offered only silence. The war had lasted long enough to divide communities and wear down patience. Veterans carried wounds that did not always show, memories that returned in dreams, anxiety that sharpened at the sound of helicopters, the stubborn ache of loss. Over time, the nation learned new words, post-traumatic stress, and wrestled with how to deliver care that matched the injury. In Vietnam, the fighting did not end. Both sides accused the other of violating the ceasefire. Without large-scale American support, South Vietnam struggled with shortages and political fractures. In March 1975, North Vietnam launched a final offensive. Cities fell quickly: Ban My Thuot, Hue, Da Nang. Refugees filled roads, clung to truck beds, and waited at airfields for aircraft that might not come. In April, as tanks approached Saigon, the United States organized Operation Frequent Wind, a frantic evacuation by helicopter from rooftops in the U.S. Embassy. On April 30, 1975, North Vietnamese troops entered the city. The war was over. Vietnam, reunified under a communist government, faced the enormous task of rebuilding a country battered by decades of conflict. The costs were staggering. More than 58,000 Americans died, hundreds of thousands were wounded. Millions of Vietnamese, North and South, were killed or displaced, along with large numbers of Laotians and Cambodians. Forests and fields bore scars from bombing and defoliants. After 1975, a wave of refugees, many taking to the ocean in small boats, sought safety in the United States, Australia, France, and elsewhere. New communities took root in unfamiliar soil. Memories traveled, 2. Photographs tucked into wallets, recipes carried in minds, lullabies sung in new languages. At home, policy shifted. In 1971, the 26th Amendment lowered the voting age to 18, an acknowledgement that those old enough to fight should be old enough to vote. In 1973, Congress passed the War Powers Resolution, insisting that the President notify Congress within 48 hours of deploying forces and limiting undeclared combat operations without legislative approval. The aim was to rebalance power after years in which a short resolution written in 1964 had effectively authorized a very long war. The phrase "lessons of Vietnam" entered the vocabulary of generals, diplomats, and activists, to be debated in classrooms and briefing rooms for decades. Culture became a second archive. Novels and films tried to make sense of chaos and conscience, sometimes focusing on soldiers' friendships, sometimes on moral ambiguity and fog and fire. Photographs did not fade: a girl burned by napalm, a prisoner executed in a Saigon street, a helicopter hovering over a rooftop while hands reach up. Musicians stripped big questions down to choruses people could sing together, songs about names on a wall, letters home, and questions a nation asks itself when the drums stop. The anti-war movement itself had many faces. Clergy held vigils and counseled draft resistors. Veterans marched in uniform and threw medals at the steps of the Capitol in a symbolic act of grief and protest. Mothers' groups in suburbs wrote congressmen with the same urgency as students on campuses. Not everyone opposed the war, not everyone supported the protests. But the movement taught skills, organizing, coalition building, public argument, that would flow into later causes: environmental protection, women's rights, disability rights, LGBTQ rights, and beyond. A generation learned that citizenship could be loud and still be loyal. The war also changed the military. The draft ended, replaced by an all-volunteer force. Training emphasized small unit leadership, cultural awareness, and combined arms coordination. Medical advances pioneered in combat, trauma surgery, helicopter evacuation, found civilian uses. Veterans built organizations to support each other, advocate for recognition of Agent Orange exposure, and press for better mental health care. Over time, the country learned to honor service even as it argued about policy. On the National Mall, a long, low wall of black granite opened to the public in 1982, the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. It listed names, nothing more, in chronological order. Some critics wanted statues and flags instead of a scar in the earth. But people came, found a name with their fingers, saw their own reflection among the letters, and understood. The design allowed room for silence. Visitors left notes, dog tags, boots, photographs. Park rangers collected them for a vast archive. The wall made space for grief without prescribing what conclusions grief should reach. If the war and the protest era feel complicated, that is because they were. The conflict in Vietnam mixed a nationalist struggle for reunification with the global Cold War. The United States sought to contain communism and support an ally. It underestimated the enemy's resilience and the importance of local legitimacy. Victory metrics often measured what could be counted rather than what truly mattered. Leaders debated privately, the public heard confidence until it no longer believed. Yet across the arc of the decade, millions of people, soldiers in the field, nurses in operating rooms, pilots in storm clouds, students on quads, clergy in pulpits, parents at kitchen tables, acted on conscience as they understood it. Step back and you can hear two soundtracks. One is mechanical, the chop of rotors, the clatter of M16 cycling, the metal wrench echo of a motor pool at night. The other is human, guitars in dorm rooms, gospel choirs in churches, chants that begin awkwardly and then gather strength as a crowd finds a common rhythm. Between the two, a generation tried to decide what kind of country it wanted to be, and who had the authority to say so. What did the era teach? That counterinsurgency is political at its core, that allies matter and so do their institutions, that transparency and trust are not luxuries but tools of strategy, that soldiers deserve clarity about missions and care when they return, that dissent can be a form of love for country, insisting it live up to its promises. It also taught that compassion travels. Vietnamese refugees rebuilt lives in places they had never heard of as children. Their food, language, and music changed the streets where they settled. The war ended, but the human weaving continued. The camera returns to a quiet Vietnamese village, decades later. Children ride bicycles past a memorial stone. A farmer pulls water from a well whose bricks were once stacked as a bunker wall. In America, a veteran stands before a polished wall and touches a name, then another. A student in a library opens a box of letters written by someone her age in 1969 and feels the voice reach across time. The soundtrack softens to acetate crackle, a record needle settles onto a groove, and an old protest song rises like a memory of a summer night. The Vietnam War and the protest era form a single, braided history. One strand is strategy and statecraft, the other is citizenship and conscience. Together they show how power and principle collide and also cooperate, how a free society argues, mourns, learns, and tries again. The lesson is not simple and not finished. It is this: decisions made in capital cities touch lives in distant villages, and the voices that rise from campuses and kitchens, from pulpits and parade grounds, from muddy fire bases and marble halls, can change the path a nation walks. Fade out on twin images, a Huey helicopter banking toward a clearing at sunset, its rotors pulling dust into rings, and a candlelight vigil on a courthouse lawn, flickering points of hope in a cool evening breeze. Between them is an era that still speaks. It asks us to remember, to listen, to debate honestly, and to keep faith with those whose names fill the rolls of memory: Americans, Vietnamese, Laotians, Cambodians, each a person loved by someone, each a thread in a story that remains our shared responsibility to tell well.